Fridays for nearly 1 year now. As you know, EGROW Foundation, or the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, has recently been set up in NCR region. It's a policy-oriented research institution. We believe in research-based policy advice. It is in this very context that in the last 1 year, we have invited the best brains from across the world, including Nobel laureates, to come and speak to us on contemporary burning issues. Continuing with that same theme, we have been having talks on fiscal policy, on monetary policy, on geopolitics, and today it is in that very context that we've invited Ambassador Sibal to come and speak to us about the US and the India's foreign policy. Today's session, we are very fortunate to have Mr. Rajiv Sikri, again Ambassador, to chair the session. Mr. Rajiv Sikri is a career diplomat for more than 36 years with the Indian Foreign Service. He retired in 2006 as Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. In this capacity, he had overall responsibility for India's relations with East Asia, ASEAN, Pacific region, the Arab world, Israel, Iran, and Central Asia. Earlier, he was Special Secretary for Economic Relations, supervising foreign economic relations, including India's external technical and economic assistance programs. He had also served as India's ambassador to Kazakhstan and headed the departments dealing with West Europe as well as the Soviet Union and East Europe. His other diplomatic assignments abroad included Deputy Chief of Mission in Paris, Critical Consular in Moscow, Deputy Consul General and Commercial Counsel in New York, and Critical First Secretary in Kathmandu. He is also a member of the Advisory Council of the Vivekananda International Foundation and Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation. With this, I now invite Mr. Rajiv Sikri to please chair the session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charan Singh, for inviting me to this very important WebEx that we are having with Ambassador Sibal, who is an old friend and a very distinguished diplomat with a very wide experience, having served as India's Foreign Secretary and also as ambassador to Russia, France, Turkey, and Egypt. He was also the Chargé d'Affaires and the Deputy Chief of Mission with the rank of Ambassador in Washington, the Chargé d'Affaires in Kathmandu, as well as has experience of having served in Portugal and Tanzania. He is a very well-known figure in India because he is a leading commentator and columnist on foreign affairs, very respected, and for his contribution to understanding and making of Indian foreign policy, he was awarded with the Padma Shri. He is also a member of the Advisory Council of the Vivekananda International Foundation and is on the New York-based board of East-West Institute. Thank you, Ambassador Sibal, for being with us this afternoon. You have a huge canvas to cover, Indian foreign policy, important issues before that today. And I think that this is an appropriate time for us to hear from you about this because we have a very complex era of uncertainty and flux. The post-Second World War structure and institutions have eroded. The dominance of the West and the United States, which was there for so many years, is over. China is rising. In fact, the whole of Asia is rising, and India is a part of that. The Soviet Union has broken up, and Russia is no longer the superpower that it used to be. In fact, the breakup of the Soviet Union has led to a lot of turmoil and uncertainty across Eurasia. And what has been happening in Afghanistan over the last 2 or 3 decades is a direct fallout of the breakup of that country. So we've been seeing now a rise of extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism. When we look at Europe, it's also a rather confusing picture. The European project of unity is stumbling. With Brexit, the United Kingdom is out, and there's a rise of nationalism and right-wing trend throughout Europe. Turning to the Pacific, of course, there are so many tensions there because there is China creating problems, South China Sea, Taiwan, North Korea remains a perennial headache, and ASEAN is also in some confusion and splintering. In the Arab world and West Asia, again, there are new trends which are emerging, and Ambassador Sibal, having served both in Egypt and Turkey, is well placed to give us a perspective on what's happening there and what it means for India. We also have now a changed scenario because of the emergence of new technologies, which are posing a danger and a threat to strategic stability. And all this is affecting India hugely because our neighborhood has become very complex. There are growing security threats because of China's growing influence, not only on our land borders, but on the Indian Ocean also. And the Pakistan-China nexus with the CPEC now in full force as the flagship project of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is strengthening the Pakistan-China connection. So there are many challenges before us. I haven't touched upon what is happening on the economic side, but I'm sure that Ambassador Sibal will touch on many of these issues in his presentation, and will give us some perspective on how we can meet these challenges, wherein there may also be some opportunities for India. So with these few words of introduction, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Sibal for his presentation. Perhaps about 35 or 40 minutes, Ambassador Sibal, would that be all right?
That's okay with me, but how much time do we have altogether?
I think we have about an hour or so. So that would leave about 20, 25 minutes for questions, or would you like to change it and make it shorter or longer as you prefer? I'll leave it to you.
I'm comfortable with that. It's okay. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Loud. Okay. Well, you have summed up the challenges that we are facing quite comprehensively. And there are no easy solutions to the challenges that we face. So foreign policy is always in the making. There is no rigidity in foreign policy. Circumstances change, international relations develop in directions that you cannot always anticipate. You've got to be nimble and adjust your foreign policy accordingly as best you can. So let me thank EGROW Foundation for having invited me and Mr. Charan Singh for giving me this opportunity. Thing is that any country's foreign policy, including ours, is never made in a vacuum. There are certain elements which govern your foreign policy, which give a direction to your foreign policy, irrespective of some of the other things that I mentioned, the changes that occur in international relations, which require constant adjustment and fine-tuning. Geography, of course, is the most important, one of the most important elements in fashioning a country's approach to the external world. There is also history, which you simply can't ignore, which colors your mental attitudes, your experience of the past and how it relates to the present and all the legacy that history leaves to you. The cultural element is very important. One can see how certain nations react in a way that not always comprehensible. But from their point of view, there are certain cultural roots to their thinking and attitude towards the external world, which shape their policies. The thinking on foreign policy, not only at the political level, but at the elite level, and increasingly at the level of civil society, also fashions the national thinking on foreign policy. When I say geography, it means that you have a neighborhood. Nobody can escape a neighborhood except island countries like Australia, which don't have any direct contiguity with anyone else. But neighborhood, kind of neighborhood you have, the nations you interact with, relate to, also contributes to the choices that you make in foreign policy. And now, increasingly, in a globalized world where countries are impinging upon each other, actually, even in the past, after all, colonialism was other nations impinging on the rest of the powerful nations, impinging on the rest of the world and ruling them and governing them and exploiting them. That was another aspect of great power politics. But in today's world, when colonialism is over, there are other forms of great power politics which impinge on you, and then you have to try and deal with those forces. In our own neighborhood, there has been a tradition of great power politics which has generally worked to our disadvantage. And then there are certain legacy issues which any government at any point in time has to deal with, especially if they're unresolved. So I think from this general statement that I made, you would be able to immediately understand the kind of problems that we face and what are the elements that shape our foreign policy. Going back a little bit, and this is important because this is what colors are thinking today, but in a different form. That is the choice of non-alignment that we made during the so-called Cold War. We did not want to join either side. We wanted to remain independent. We wanted to make our own decisions, realizing our weaknesses. It was not as if we allowed our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities to constrict beyond a certain point freedom of choice in terms of determining ties with the countries abroad. Here, I think there is a mistaken notion that until the Cold War ended, it was a bipolar world. It was certainly not a bipolar world. India spanned both these so-called poles. We had, well, reasonably good ties with Europe, problematic ties with the US, but nevertheless, we were engaging the US and we had very good ties with Russia and the so-called socialist world. Even at that time, our relation with China superficially seemed good. And there was the entire non-aligned movement, which we founded, more than 100 countries or whatever. And they were not part of either bloc, so it was never a bipolar world. And this is important because today, once again, one is talking about a new kind of bipolarity between the United States and China. If India could fashion a foreign policy which was not, which waded through this so-called bipolar world reasonably successfully and not allowed itself to be caught in the trap of bipolarity, this is not going to happen again, even if there is a kind of a new Cold War between the United States and China. Now, with the end of the Cold War, more openings came our way in terms of developing ties, deepening ties, exploring new opportunities, redressing some of the wrinkles of the past. And therefore, what we see today in terms of foreign policy is as a result of the freeing of the international system in a certain way, where countries like India, which hitherto also were able to develop tout azimut, as they say in French, in all directions of the compass relationship with the rest of the world, are able now to do so with less difficulties. Not as if they are not difficulties still, but with less difficulties. One of the fallouts of the end of the Cold War, and which has now become an important element in our foreign policy, is the India-US relationship. If you look at the range of the relationship and the areas in which we talk to each other, engage with each other, collaborate with each other, there is no other relationship which even closely matches this, with almost 200,000 students in the United States, a 4 or 5 million strong diaspora, and we see increasingly how people of Indian origin are now rising to the very top in the United States system, whether it's the administration or the business community or the academic world or the financial sector. With the 2005 nuclear agreement with the United States, a whole lot of the weight of the past was shed, because really speaking, the United States was the country that targeted us strategically the most. I don't think, apart from their known adversaries, that they had targeted any other so-called friendly democratic country the way they did until effectively the nuclear agreement. And since then, our ties in various directions have grown. Our trade is, in 2020, was $146 billion. And remarkably, we have a surplus with the United States in the overall trade in both goods and services. Our knowledge economy is increasingly tied with the United States. The defense ties have deepened remarkably. And this is important because in the area of defense, unless you have a minimum of trust in a country, you don't allow your defense capacities to be compromised. And in the United States, there's always a risk that this might happen because of the looseness of their system and the variety of lobbies that are work, and some of their agendas, which on the face of it look like principles, but actually are geopolitical instruments to put pressure on countries, including countries like India. With China, we have this legacy of a historical mistake. When we gave up our all rights in Tibet in 1954, we recognized Tibet region as a part of China without any quid pro quo, thinking that if we satisfied Mao Zedong on Tibet, then China would keep itself on the other side of the Himalayas, not come into South Asia. And India and China could together, in the romantic vision of Nehru, shape the future of Asia free from its past colonial heritage. So we are paying the price of that today, and currently we've seen how our entire policy, especially from 1988, to reach out to China, engage China, separate our politics from our economics, put aside the border issue to be resolved separately in stages, but in other areas allow the relationship to find some kind of a normal level of engagement. Now that policy has collapsed with what China did earlier in Doklam, and then now in Ladakh, where now we are faced with a very, very difficult situation, because the earlier arrangements have been violated by China without giving us any explanation in terms of the various political rounds of discussions we've had, as well as military rounds of discussions, which means that we are still guessing as to, well, we can have a broad idea based on China's conduct elsewhere and declared ambitions of China, what they hope to achieve and seek in the years ahead. But in terms of why they think that they can do this by alienating a country like India beyond a certain point is difficult to comprehend. And which is why we're still at a bit of a crossroads as to how to deal with this country. We're keeping the doors of a dialogue open. We've not closed it, because if we close the doors, then we will be under greater pressure from the United States in particular to join hands with them to confront China with all the consequences of that down the line in terms of the independence of our foreign policy. As a result of China's pressure, we've now very clearly embraced the Indo-Pacific concept and accord. We began hesitatingly for this reason, that we felt that our foreign policy choices should not be constricted beyond a point, and we should not become beholden to a set of countries, which then prevented us from engaging with other countries with which our interests were tied. But now, if you see from our from the statements that we are making, we are increasingly comfortable with both the Indo-Pacific concept and the Quad. For the first time, I heard our Prime Minister say in the Security Council when we were chairing it, and he was addressing the forum, that India is a net security provider in the Indian Ocean, which means that we have accepted burden sharing, and we see the Indo-Pacific, Indian and Pacific Oceans tied together in terms of maritime security. And whereas the United States will bear the burden of handling the Western Pacific part, India will be doing more burden sharing in the Indian Ocean, not only with the United States, but as we are doing currently with France in a major way. The maritime security route of China poses a lot of problems for us in terms of managing our Indian Ocean states with Sri Lanka and Maldives. Maldives, we have recovered our position a little bit, but Sri Lanka, we are still not very sure whether we can protect our equities from being eroded by China. This churn has two consequences for our relations with Russia. One is that Russia has become concerned about the level of our ties with the United States of America, and they fear that, and they say this openly, that the United States is dragging us into some kind of a military alliance, and they see the Quad as a forerunner of that. And for them, that would be, in terms of their own foreign policy towards India and the region, a very big setback, which is why they want to keep India anchored in organizations in which they play a prominent role. Heretofore, actually the dominant role, but that role now has been taken over by China. And here I mean the RIC, Russia-India Dialogue, the BRICS Forum, as well as the SCO. We are very happy in terms of, and that's the second point, in maintaining a balance in our foreign policy and work with Russia and keep Russia anchored to us for two reasons. One, that these are the organizations, RIC, BRICS, and SCO, in which, especially the first two, in which Russia played the leading role in setting them up. And therefore, if we walked out of them or diluted our presence, then Russia would be liberated to that extent to not give due concern to our interests in the developing situation, and also weigh more in favor of China's worldview and its regional interests. And secondly, it helps us to maintain what is the new version of our independence foreign policy, which is strategic autonomy. There are some who cavil at this concept, I think mistakenly, because this doesn't mean that we are sitting on the fence. It simply means that we are not going to get into a situation where X country, let's say the United States, has an irrational policy or a provocative policy towards Y country, which is our friend, and they expect us to take their side against Y country. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And this is what strategic autonomy means, that we will work with you strategically where our interests are in alignment or can be made to align by greater effort to mutual advantage, but we will stay away from wrong decisions that you make, and we do not want to be a party to those decisions, especially if they are directed against countries with which we have vital interests. And here I have Russia in mind. United States wants to dilute India's relationship with Russia, not only in the defense domain, where they want to supplant Russia as the main defense provider to India, but also hedging Russia more geopolitically as an adversary by weaning India away and tilting the balance, geopolitical balance, again against Russia even all the more. But this doesn't suit our interests at all, because even today, 60% of our defense supplies come from Russia. And just when we had this problem in Ladakh, our defense minister went to Russia and made demands for 8 critical supplies urgently. The Russians within 3 weeks agreed, which was remarkable. And they have now and earlier dipped into their own reserves to provide us what we need. And this despite the fact that there were some noises made by China that during the time we are having this Ladakh confrontation, Russia should slow down defense supplies to India. So Russia has demonstrated to China that just as we in India want to maintain a balance between the United States and Russia, Russia wants to maintain a balance between their relations with China and with India, both of whom they have strategic ties, but they don't want to make one relationship contingent on the other. India has ambitions to be a leading power. This has been enunciated by our external affairs minister, and in different ways by our prime minister, but not so openly. But the thrust of his policies and wanting India to is clear that we have certain ambitions for India. We are rising as an economy. All the projections are that by certainly 2050, we'll be the second largest economy in the world, but in phases, we'll become bigger and bigger as an economy, which will then make us more and more attractive, which will release resources for building up our military strength, which will mean then, therefore, that we'll be even less, it will be even less possible to ignore us when it comes to all major international decisions. So we want a multipolar world. I mean, simply because we want it, it's not going to happen. But the trends are in that direction, because US still is the foremost power, but its relative power has declined. China has ambitions to have a G2 and be the hegemonic power, at least in Asia. But we've been saying openly that a multipolar world demands that first Asia is multipolar, which is a clear signal that we're not going to accept Chinese hegemony. We have therefore the ambition to be a permanent membership of the UN Security Council. We are maintaining the dynamism of our policy with Africa. Our Act East policy, though it has not shaped up in terms of connectivity as well as we might have wanted, but still there's definitely much greater emphasis on our relations with Southeast Asia. So is the case with Japan. Very wisely, India is also building constituencies with smaller countries, and this is to project ourselves, project our leadership. We've had a summit meeting of India and the Caribbean countries. We've had a summit meeting between India and the Pacific island states. This is part of our building constituencies, not only in the United Nations, but also in other areas of global negotiations. Just to go back a little bit to the strategic autonomy business, the point is that it's not as if India needs to make a choice between one side or the other side. Our foreign policy is pretty adept from the time we became independent in handling contradictions between major powers. Today the contradictions which face us is how to handle the deteriorating US-China ties, the deteriorating US-Russia ties, and the vastly improving China-Russia ties, and that we are doing in the way that I earlier explained, how we have a foot in all the organizations which are headed or which are influenced by these countries without having to make a choice. If you really look at it, all major countries preserve their strategic autonomy. The country that preserves it the most is the United States of America. They openly declare they are an exceptional country. They are everywhere in the globe. They manage contradictions, whether it's between the Arabs and Israelis, or the Israelis and the Palestinians, or within West Asia, handling earlier on the contradiction between the Gulf states and states like the more revolutionary states. In Western Pacific, US has huge relationship with China. It has a huge relationship with Japan. It is faced with the problem between Japan and China, but it is handling it in a manner in which it actually protects basically its own interests. They want stronger security ties, but they let Philippines down when it came to Scarborough Shoal. So it's not as if they wed themselves to a particular country at the cost of the country. But more importantly for us, what they did in Afghanistan, knowing fully well what Pakistan's ambitions are in Afghanistan, the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban. They just handed over Afghanistan to the Pakistan Taliban regime, knowing fully well that one of the biggest consequences of this will be for India, with which they otherwise want to develop a very close strategic relationship, which is essentially focused on the maritime domain, but on the landmass of Asia, they have worked against our interests knowingly. It's not as if they have done this blindly, but it suited their national interest to do what they did. And they feel powerful enough to be able to manage this contradiction, that deal with India, strengthen and deepen ties with India with regard to China. But at the same time, on the landmass of Asia, indirectly help build China's equities and power into the west of us through Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan. So in Europe, France is an open supporter of strategic autonomy, and they want Europe to move in that direction, but I won't go into that because there's a great deal of resistance. China keeps its strategic autonomy. Russia keeps its strategic autonomy. Our problem is that no, let me before I come to that. Pakistan, you would have said, why I mentioned Pakistan and terrorism and Kashmir and stuff like that. Now, this has been a huge problem area in our foreign policy, dating back to our independence and the division of our country on the basis of religion. In Pakistan playing the religious card against us, his claims on Kashmir, which are basically based on religion, promotion of terrorism, and that through jihadi organization, which again has a religious connotation, is diplomacy in the OIC to mobilize Islamic support against India. But what is remarkable, and this is certainly in a sense a new element that has emerged in India's foreign policy, is the vast improvement in our relations with the conservative Gulf countries. Contrast this with the time after our independence, 50s, 60s, and whatever, when our primary relationship was with the revolutionary Arab regimes, secular, anti-Islamic, revolutionary, socialist Arab regimes. Today, that relationship has relatively receded into the background. And the great success of our ties now is with the conservative Gulf monarchies, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia. Oman, we always have good ties, but the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, there is both these countries have actually honored Modi by giving him their highest civilian award, and the internal transformation of these countries has been remarkable. We were able earlier on to separate our relationship with Israel and the Arab world, including the Gulf countries, and now we have this remarkable thing where some of these countries have normalized their relationship with Israel, and we have gone and in a sense created a Western Quad consisting of UAE, Israel, United States, and India, something inconceivable a few years ago. This is the extent to which Indian foreign policy has been able to adjust itself to new opportunities that have arisen. Energy dependence, this has to be a constant of India. This has to be a constant factor in shaping our external relationship, because we have to make sure that we continue to have access to energy, because our own hydrocarbon resources are very limited. There is now great pressure even on the utilization of coal as an energy source. So we have to then go in for new technologies, green technologies, but that's going to take time, and that's mixed up with so many other issues of financing and everything, and technology and everything else. So while that transition, during the phase of how we transition from today's energy dependence on hydrocarbons to renewable energies, we have to make sure that our energy supplies don't get disrupted in any way, and we have access to energy at reasonable prices, which means that we have to, and we've done that, both disperse the sources of supply to reduce dependence to the extent possible on the Middle East or West Asia for this, and we are focusing a lot on Russia. In fact, the biggest investments that India intends to make in the energy sector anywhere today is in Russia. Terrorism continues to be a huge challenge, and you will see that in every statement that we make, any joint statement that we draft with any country, and whatever we say in United Nations or in other forums is there's a lot of accent on terrorism, to mobilize international consciousness more and more to the challenges that we face, and especially these challenges after what's happened in Afghanistan have become more and more serious. Finally, 2-3 things. Our foreign policy has also to cope with the kind of these are not old things, but these are issues that are coming to the fore with the Modi government in power in India. The whole issue of democracy and human rights and religious tolerance, and the manner in which the Western media, in fact, deals with India. This is, see, at the level of the governments, because the governments look at issues in a hard-hearted manner, and they look at the totality of things. But they are compelled by domestic lobbies, especially in the United States and to some extent in Europe, to take up all these issues of democracy, human rights, and religious tolerance, and beat India with these sticks and with their so-called liberal press attacking us constantly. And in this, of course, our own domestic political lobbies participate very eagerly, because they feel that as a democratic country, we cannot but be sensitive to how the world looks at us. Unlike China and others, which can control the flow of information from outside. In India, as a democratic country, we can't. So they do politics using this weapon against their own government also. The new issues that we are going to face with in terms of foreign policy, which is a product of globalization, challenges that globalization is creating in various ways, and the fact that globalization was actually a the US Western way of shaping the world to suit their own ideology and economic interests. But at the same time, it has released certain forces which now need more regulation and control. There's the digital revolution, the social media, the whole data issues. All these are become very important in terms of conducting our foreign policy and building ties and relationship. Because since our interaction with the rest of the world, especially the Western world, has become very diverse, and these are parts of these diverse strands. So in order to make sure that one strand, a negative strand, that does not affect the other positive strands, we are compelled to engage on these issues in a relatively open and accommodative manner, but at the same time, not yielding on our basic interests. And this creates difficulties in management of our foreign policy, including with the United States of America. The new challenges that we will have to deal with because of the sentiment against globalization, the weakening of the WTO, the fact that countries are now going in for regional trade agreements, and we still haven't made up our mind about how far do we want to go down the road of FTAs. Though with Britain, we are discussing an FTA with UAE. Our minister said in January we'll sign one. With Australia, we are discussing it. The supply chain issues have become very, very important after the pandemic. So the talk about resilient and trustworthy supply chains, that's an important issue. Then the whole issue of new technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics. All this is figured in our Quad agenda at the summit level, where the whole idea is that at least these 4 countries will come together and pool their resources as much as they can in terms of making sure that the attempts by China to dominate some of these sectors and become an absolutely inalienable part of global supply chains, that threat is countered effectively by becoming more self-reliant in these things. And we've taken a major step in terms of our semiconductor. Our desire to build a semiconductor industry, as you would have seen, the kind of incentives that we are willing to give. Finally, the diaspora, which is remarkable, the kind of achievements of our diaspora in the West, whether it brings us the kind of advantages that we might seek, that we might wish for, because in paper it looks remarkable, but whether our diaspora can be leveraged the same way as the Chinese have been able to leverage their diaspora for their development is a challenge that we face. But this government has done a lot in terms of mobilizing the diaspora in favor of India. So I'll end by saying that Indian diplomacy has become much more effective, much more confident. We are willing now to reach out in areas which we were earlier shy and reticent because we felt we didn't have enough weight and power and leverage to do these things, and always fearing a backlash if we took certain initiatives. But I think we are moving out of that phase, which is a good thing. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sibal, for your fascinating and wide-ranging tour d'horizon of the challenges before India in contemporary world. Before I open the floor for questions, I would just like to make 2 or 3 observations and perhaps suggestions where I would like to elicit your response. Undoubtedly, the relationship with the United States is, as you have said, very wide-ranging, strategic, and perhaps essential from India's point of view today. But do you see any limits on this partnership? What do you think could be the limits on this partnership? Insofar as China is concerned, Galwan, I think, changed the whole narrative with China. And it seems to me that for the foreseeable future, we are likely to see more competition and maybe even confrontation rather than cooperation. Yes, the doors of dialogue are open, will remain open, but the situation could get more complicated once the Dalai Lama is no longer on the scene. And I suppose that in our policy thinking also, we should be looking at what are the possible leverages that we have against China and how we can use them. Some thoughts on that, if you would. Russia, of course, remains a very important partner for the reasons that you have mentioned. And I think Mr. Putin's recent visit to India was very important. But the weaknesses here are an inadequate economic base and very poor people-to-people linkages. How do you think we can sustain this relationship on any basis other than the defense and the strategic side? You have rightly pointed out about the Gulf countries, but I would welcome if you have any thoughts on what kind of a role Iran will play, because we have joined this new quad, the West Asian quad, so to speak. But Iran is a factor that cannot be ignored. And finally, insofar as our immediate neighborhood is concerned, do you have any thoughts on what could be an overarching policy? Pakistan is a separate case. I would leave that aside. But I think what is happening in Nepal is worrying. Sri Lanka, you've already mentioned. And while relations with Bangladesh are very good just now, we have our president there just now. But there are some worrying trends that do the relations with Bangladesh have an enduring basis? Do they go beyond Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League? And in the overall neighborhood policy, what could be the elements like more money, less arrogance, more sensitivity, whatever red lines and so forth? If you would like to touch upon some of any of these.
I would gladly touch upon this, but on each of these, one could have.
I know. So I'll leave it to you to decide whatever you think.
But therefore, if I was to give comprehensive answer to each of these, I think I'll be able to touch only one or two of your questions. So the fact that I will limit the scope of my answers should not mean that I haven't looked at the issue broadly. It simply is that
I understand
to be as succinct as possible. Now, in terms of limits to our relationship with the United States, we are already establishing limits. Now, for example, you take the whole threat of Katsa and S-400. We've clearly told the Americans and that we're not going to allow our foreign policy towards Russia to be dictated by any third country, the United States. And we're willing to take the risk, and we leave it to the better judgment of the United States not to take action which will actually, in a sense, damage the ties and recreate in our minds all the past suspicions about America not being trustworthy and the danger of exposing ourselves to pressures. In fact, the more we become dependent on the United States in various ways, the more they will be able to pressure us to toe their lines. Now, I just give you an example. Yesterday or day before, I was speaking in a forum where there were very senior American leaders present. And after I gave my gave my briefing on the Putin's visit, the one question they had in mind was that if tomorrow Russia invades Ukraine, whose side will you take? Now, come off it. I mean, I didn't want to be aggressive and say that, look, you want to make serious mistakes and then you want to make us pay the cost for your mistakes. I didn't say that, but point is that this itself suggests that we have to be careful, that we extract the maximum from this relationship, and but let it not go the last mile, where we lose our ability to function independently, because they'll put pressure on us in every way. On the economic side, they want to actually shape as they try to shape the global economy in their favor, they want to shape the Indian economy in their favor. They are totally against this whole idea of common and differentiated responsibility and some special considerations for the developing countries and this and that. They are against that. When they talk about a level playing field, what they actually mean is that the past playing field, which is always advantageous to the West, should be retained, and that is what is the level playing field for them. That any change, any reform, any effort to build up domestic capacity and all is anathema for them. Number two, I think we are all agreed that when it comes to the Asian landmass, we cannot expect any help from the United States to face the real challenges on the ground that we face from China and Pakistan combined. As you know, in the case of Pakistan, we have experience of 75 years or whatever it is of US policy towards Pakistan, which has never really been helpful. And on Afghanistan, I mentioned how, in fact, it is most unhelpful. They have never really taken a strong position on the CPEC. They haven't used their leverages with Pakistan. They have just imposed more sanctions on Russia and China, but no sanctions on Pakistan. And worst is that in this democracy summit, they didn't invite Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, but they invited Pakistan. Now, apart from West Asia, Western Pacific, where they have footprint on the Asian landmass, but in one corner, but in the rest of Asia, they've just been excluded. And Afghanistan was the last foothold, and that's gone. It's only the maritime space where, yes, we must build on our common and shared interests in the maritime space against China. And there, yes, there is a potential, and that potential should continue to be explored. But there's a limit in terms of the overall strategic ties, because there's a difference between what they can do for us on land and what they can do for us on the sea. Keeping in mind that the China threat for the next 10 years is going to be really potent on land and not potent on sea. It may after 10 years become more potent, but we are able to manage. We'll be able to manage that challenge much more easily than we can the land challenge. In terms of transfer of technologies, civilian and military dual use, I think we can't rely too much on the United States of America. We have to put our own act together as best as we can and get inputs to the extent we can from the United States. So you've seen how the DTTI never really produced the results that we wanted. They are willing to sell us certain maritime technologies and AVs and stuff like that. But in terms of building our domestic capability, the way the US system works is not going to be easy. Insofar as China is concerned, Dalai Lama, yes, the Dalai Lama is already young, and the issue will arise. And China has made it clear that they want to Sinicize the Tibetan religion, and they have already taken steps in that direction. And they will choose their own Dalai Lama, and they've already started making noises that no country should interfere in this affair. We'll be faced with a clear challenge if, let's say, the Dalai Lama or the next Dalai Lama comes from Taiwan or territory outside China, and China, like they did in the case of the Panchen Lama, produced their own Dalai Lama, then which Dalai Lama is recognized by the rest of the world. United States and the Western world are not going to recognize any Dalai Lama that China produces from their hat. India should not either. India should not either, and they should continue to support the Dalai Lama that is produced according to the traditional religious practices of the Tibetans. That will be, how much of a leverage would that be? Because China has really clamped down on Tibet, and the manner in which they have created military infrastructure and bases and airfields and positioned large armies, the military deployment there, closed the Tibet from outside penetration. Our people, even Tibetans located here, find it very difficult to actually make contacts on the ground, because the system that they've created are such that instantaneously they know if there's somebody from abroad, this is what I'm told, contacted anybody inside Tibet. So it's become very difficult. They've stopped the outflow of Tibetan refugees into Nepal and then into India. Taiwan, to my mind, is a kind of a leverage. But I find that the government of India ministry is very reluctant to use that leverage, because they think it is a red line for China. And if you want to maintain a semblance of a sort of working relationship with China, where some kind of a dialogue is maintained, then the best is not to use that leverage at this point in time. Maybe at some future date when we are faced with a real conflict, then maybe we will be able to make that provocation in inverted commas. But making that provocation ahead of a real conflict situation in China, I mean a military situation with China, may not be seen as a leverage. The other leverage, of course, is which we are using but not very effectively so far, is to deny China access to our market. I'm told by our policymakers that don't be fooled by this $100 billion figure. China is not very happy with that, because this is at the lower end of things. What they really want is penetrating our market in terms of new technologies and everything else, where we are keeping them out. And all the restrictions that we have also placed in terms of vetting Chinese investments, that's where it's hurting them, because the rest of the world is looking at the Indian market. After all, they don't love us because we are what we are. They love us because they see there's a huge expanding market going ahead. But China is being kept. That's another leverage that we have. The other is what we are doing. How effective it is, I can't say it is Quad, giving greater security dimension to Quad as we go on. Building our deterrent capabilities more and more. We are already signaling to China quite openly, which we never did before, how we are developing new technologies and demonstrating them, including a special service operation in the northeast, which sending a signal to China of operations behind the enemy lines. This is not the sort of thing we were doing earlier, but we're doing that. Insofar as Russia is concerned, yes, the $10 billion trade is totally insufficient. But I don't know. We've gone through this earlier, and things have not lived up to expectations. But there seems to be some seriousness in terms of doing something in Russia's Far East. After all, we've given $1 billion credit line, which the modalities of which are being finalized. There is on paper this Vladivostok Chennai corridor, which will begin to make sense the moment the investments we are making in Russia's far north, the Arctic and the oil fields and gas fields there, begins to generate energy for our sources, and that energy will have to be transported through the through the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. That'll give a stake to Russia in this corridor and in the Indo-Pacific. And all the oil fields in which we are investing are around the Arctic. So the Arctic route, which could open up, could actually play an important role in expanding India-Russia economic ties and removing some of the wrinkles that have appeared with regard to how Russia looks at the Indo-Pacific and how we look at the Indo-Pacific. Insofar as people-to-people ties are concerned, Rajiv, let me put it a bit, is half seriously, half not so seriously, is that we have excellent people-to-people ties on paper because we belong to the same civilization and cultural heritage as Nepal, as Sri Lanka, as Bangladesh in some senses. But it doesn't help us. So the people-to-people ties, we've had reasonably good people-to-people ties during the phase when United States was kicking us as hard as they could on really strategic issues. So I'm not too sure how people-to-people ties can be or should be critical in terms of developing ties with another country in a meaningful manner and extracting the best out of it. And sometimes these people-to-people ties can work against our own interests, as we see in some sections in the United States, where elements of the diaspora actually are at the source of many of our problems relating to some of the sensitive issues I mentioned earlier. In terms of the Gulf, yes, I agree with you that we've discussed it on other occasions, that we have to keep our lines open to Iran. In terms of the depth and quality of our relationship with the Gulf countries, Iran may not compare because our equities there are much, much greater than in Iran. But in Iran, we have certain other equities in terms of connectivity to Central Asia, prospectively to Russia through the international North-South corridor. And the fact that Iran is the real regional power. And that's the reason why everybody wants to oppose it's playing any significant regional role, because that country can play that role. And despite all the pressures that they've been subject to, it's remarkable. The resilience is remarkable. It's admirable in some ways that they succeeded in maintaining, in a sense, their own autonomy, faced with the severest challenges. So it's a country that should be taken seriously. But there are a lot of impediments which are in the way, but yet we have maintained some degree of equities with them through Chabar and which we should build on. And our foreign minister has twice visited Iran. And this is at a time when the sentiments, although with Biden, things were a little less difficult than under Trump, because Biden wanted to come back into the JCPOA. But nevertheless, despite all the animus against Iran in the Congress and the think tanks and everything else, and with this Katsa thing hanging on our head, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, he visited Iran twice. Twice he's met Raisi. So we're keeping our channels of dialogue open. On the neighborhood, I will not go into detail, but I've said this very, very often, that while it's important to have good relations with neighbors, and it's an asset if you can manage good ties with them, but no big country has good relations with neighbors. The United States has not been able to manage Cuba for all these decades. Russia is at odds with its neighbors. China, barring Pakistan, is at odds with all neighbors. And look at the way China has grown remarkably. They're not being held back because of problems with neighbors. And our own, if you really look at it, Rajiv, I don't know, some study should, more deep study needs to be made. That is it a fact that either our economic growth or the impact of our foreign policy has suffered in any significant way because of our problems with our neighbors? I think if our economy has not grown sufficiently, it's because of our own policies at home. Rajiv, you and I have served together in Nepal. I've never bought this whole India being arrogant with its neighbors. In fact, we've been as accommodative as possible. It cannot be entirely a one-way street. I.K. Gujral tried this non-reciprocity. It didn't work. I've written a couple of articles how it didn't work at all. So I think there are certain realities in the life of a nation that you have to accept and move on.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sibal, for your masterly exposition on this matter. I have a few people who'd like to speak. I see Mr. Charan Singh and Professor Vishan Das. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Charan Singh.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sibal. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sikri. You made the discussion so lively and so interesting. I'll be very honest with you. Very, very informative discussion. But forgive me, I'm not a diplomat and I've never learned diplomacy. And I've suffered severely, most importantly, at my own home because I've never been able to use diplomatic language. So let me once again, if ever burn myself today, and please forgive me if you find my observations and comments or questions are rather too straightforward. My first as an economist, trained economist, having lived abroad for nearly 10 years, worked at the International Monetary Fund and looked at the economic diplomats and economic diplomacy closely, studied at Harvard and Stanford and looked at the Chinese foreign service recruits come and interact. Are there any lessons from China for India? 1978, we Chinese and Indians were the same, but the way the Chinese galloped ahead, and though you say that you were in Nepal and you did a lot for Nepal, I had a chance to visit Nepal and interact with Nepalese. I can tell you, sadly, the way they hated Indians. I also had a chance to interact with Chinese at great length while I was studying at Stanford, and I can tell you how strategic thinkers they are. So, are there lessons for India from China? What they did? Second, continuing the same thought of lessons for India from China, how come in 1978 they were as poor and as backward as us? And by 2020, 9 lakh foreign companies were operating in China and not in India. Though we shared the same democratic values, our computer skills, our English speaking, everything was there. Nobody wanted to talk to China 2 decades back, and suddenly China has become the fulcrum of global growth. The Americans could beat the Japanese in global growth and through the lower accords, but they could not do that to China. So, what are the lessons we need to learn from China? The second question I have, Ambassador, is how come we lost? How come, despite our soft diplomacy, despite we also ran approach, we lost in the Security Council? And today, we can't even make an inch into the Security Council. We are kept at bay all the time. These nice, good boys that we are we here only to suffer? Is it something a failure of our foreign policy? The third and the last point, Ambassador, is my feeling is, and I could be totally wrong, that the embassies of China made headway deep and aggressive, that they could attract despite a polar difference in ideologies, they could attract foreign investment in large numbers so that foreign companies started operating in China. Our embassies did not push India and India's ideology into the rest of the world to attract as many foreign companies as China successfully did it. My last observation, Ambassador, maybe I'm right or wrong, and you would please guide me on that. Did India lack strong and decisive leaders like Vajpayee, who did Pokhran, and Modi, who's really making a change, as you yourself mentioned? Is it because we lacked decisive leadership? Thank you.
Very, very pertinent questions, and the sort of questions that I love to answer. Look, there are no lessons that India could learn from China, for the simple reason that China is a very different animal from India. Their whole culture, background, history, their centralized system, the way they organize their society, the discipline that they enforce on their society. Even now during the pandemic, if you see the manner in which they just lock down whole areas, cities, and subject everybody to rectum examinations 3 times a day. The one-child policy, which sort of intruded into the bedrooms of its population and imposed that kind of a restriction on freedom within the confines of your bedroom of their citizenry. And the manner in which they created these economic zones, which were totally cut off from the domestic market, and just created little enclaves where these guys could come and set up, invest, and then export from there to the rest of the world. No judicial system that you can approach to get redress. No rule of the law as the West understands, and they beat the rest, us and the rest of the world with as if it is an absolute prerequisite for investment and stuff like that. The point is that all this talk about soft power and ideological differences, this is there to some extent. But you ask the Wall Street and the US investors even today whether they believe in this, that ideology should guide investment and economic policies, you will get unexpected answers. I heard the other day a video recording of one of the biggest hedge funds, the CEO of the biggest hedge funds. And it's remarkable how he totally evaded all questions regarding to human rights issues, Xinjiang. And he said, look, that is for the governments to decide. It's not for us, the business community, to look at these issues. We look at objective factors, rate of return and stuff like that. It's totally amoral, if not immoral, in terms of thinking and approach. So it's all very well for the West to talk about values and ideologies and democracy and stuff like that. But when it comes to hard policies, it has never been the case. We were a democracy right from the time of Nehru, and Pakistan was hardly ever a democracy. But you see how they dealt with Pakistan and how they dealt with us, coming closer to home, where we actually see how much they have remained committed to formulate their foreign policy in accordance with the values that they espouse. Now the thing is that United States, since you served in the United States, you got a good feel of that. They've always been fascinated by China. Always been fascinated. And it goes back to the time when they're Baptists and everybody else there, and the kind of harvesting of souls that they want to do in India, piecemeal here and there, they were doing in China long back. When I used to go to public libraries in Washington, and I used to see the shelves of books relating to China and those relating to India. Very huge, going back to the 19th century and all, huge disparity. And they've always had this vision that if we could get access to this 1.3 billion market, we'll make a huge amounts of money and this and that. Always tempted them. And then Bill Clinton found a very good formula. After all, if values and everything else and democracy and all these were important, how come they were dealing with Maoist China? How did Nixon reach out to Maoist China, and how later Clinton and others dealt with this country? And the excuse was a very cynical one to say, you know, as we engage with them more, as they get developed more, as they have a bigger middle class, they'll become democratic and this and that. This was to justify dealing with a authoritarian, dictatorial kind of a regime during the Cold War and the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, because otherwise there would have been no justification. So the justification was anticipatory, that we'll deal with these communist fellows, but they'll become less communist as they go on. They've never had that kind of thinking and approach towards India. Then, of course, the Chinese have been, and the system allowed it. They unlike us, you know, when I went to Vajpayee to China in 2003, we met the mayor of Shanghai, and he was briefing us on the modernization of Shanghai. It was already a glittering city, but not as much as it is today. And he said, without batting an eyelid, that I move out 1 million people a year from Shanghai. And here you try and move out 10 people. You know, you can't do it. The courts intervene, the civil society intervenes, the press is against you. Now, point is, if you then want to ignore some of the domestic pressures that you have, which are inherent in a democratic system, then you'll get a huge backlash. As it is, the government is already getting that backlash, that you are killing democracy, there's a backsliding of democracy, it is this, it is that. So I think it's not as if we should find an excuse for our inability to develop as fast as China has done. We could have still developed reasonably better if we had made certain economic choices, if we were sufficiently internally united, if there was a sufficient consensus here at home. Look at the Maoist phenomenon. After all, there has been a view that the biggest challenge India faces is from Maoism internally. Can you conceive of that in China? Especially now with their surveillance techniques and everything else, the manner in which they have dealt with Uyghurs and Tibetans and stuff like that, you can't do that. So, I don't think there is a lesson to be learned from China, because the objective circumstances are very different. This is not to justify our own failings, where our failings are unique to ourselves and not in relation to China. That is one answer. The other is our embassies not being able to mobilize investments. See, the embassies are there to act on the basis of policies of the government of India, the directives of the government of India. Independently of the government of India, they can't create an atmosphere of improved inward investments from United States or elsewhere into India, when some of the objective factors which are holding back investment even today, all these factor stuff and labor and land acquisition and labor laws and everything else that they say we need to do in terms of making ourselves attractive. That argument and that complaint against India continues even today. When this Thai lady came here, the USTR, if you look at her public statements, these could have been made 20 years ago. The same thing: high tariffs, regulatory process, level playing field, more market access. Same things. Despite the fact that in the meantime, objectively, since you are an economist, you would know that there are many things government has done in terms of opening up our market. But since recently we raised our tariffs on some of these things, so that's become a late motive that we are not making ourselves hospitable enough in terms of, and the fact also is that in terms of shift of supply chains from China, they've gone to Vietnam, they've gone to other parts of Southeast Asia, they've come to Bangladesh, but they are not coming to India because, again, the same argument is given that you must make your system more open and you must have improved infrastructure. You must change of procedures, including custom procedures and everything else, taxation issues. All these things are there. Then Nepal. Well, you see, Nepal has this thing which is ingrained in their thinking, which is very frustrating. And in our time with Rajiv, when I was there in 1982, I mean, their view is that we are non-aligned between India and China, and we are not to the extent that we are not a South Asian country, because the northern Nepal is part of the Tibetan plateau, so we span South Asia and Tibet. They've always felt threatened by India because of closeness of culture and family ties, and of course the Madheshi bit. They're extremely hypersensitive about sovereignty issues, which they raise deliberately in order to keep India at bay. They are, in some senses, the most negative, the most difficult and negative neighbor, because ostensibly we tend to believe that they are like us, and what is that? Roti beti stuff and all. At least with the others, Pakistan, or to some extent Bangladesh before Sheikh Hasina came, we knew where we stood with them. With these guys, you don't know where you actually stand. Nepal is a very water issues. Look, they've been sitting on these water resources. They could easily have collaborated with us. They could have earned a lot of revenue, like Bhutan has been earning. They would have met our energy needs, flood control, and everything else. But they never wanted to do that. So, because they look at this kind of an interdependence as damaging to Nepal's sovereignty, they didn't want to do it. And even today, now of course we have moved past it. We are not thinking about managing our energy requirements through hydroelectric power from Nepal. But nevertheless, I used to tell them that, look, you made a huge mistake, that you could have earned a lot of revenue. You could have then used that money to develop your hinterland, your countryside, and everything else. Given the result was that you allowed foreign NGOs and foreign governments to actually work in the countryside. They never saw the face of the government. They only saw the NGOs and everything working. So you actually, in a sense, eroded the standing of your own government with your people by not being seen as present in the countryside for their development, which you left to foreign interests. Anyway, Nepal is a special case. What else do you say?
I think that was what
Security Council, the last.
Yeah.
Security Council, China, of course, as you know, is opposing us. America for a long time has been opposing us. And even now, though they say that they support India's permanent membership in a reformed Security Council, but what a reformed Security Council would be, what shape it will take, how many numbers there would be, America is a big hurdle. At the same time, Africa can't make up its mind as to who should represent Africa. And Russia, although they support our permanent membership, but if you look at what Lavrov has been saying, is that there should be near total consensus. This is not the requirement of the UN Charter, which is 2/3 majority. But they're not satisfied with 2/3 majority because they don't want Japan to come in. They don't want Germany to come in. China doesn't want Japan to come in. They don't want India to come in. So it's a mess. So I don't think that we're going to become permanent members in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibal. I think we have overstepped the time, but it's been such a fascinating discussion, and I would like to give the floor, if I may, Dr. Charan Singh. Do we have a few more minutes?
If Ambassador Sibal agrees, I think we should. It's such an interesting and fascinating.
Since we started 15 minutes late, I don't.
Okay, so there's Professor Ashok Vishan Das, and then I see that there was somebody Mr. Das, I think, who had a question about growing fundamentalism in Bangladesh. Yeah, not audible, Professor Vishan Das.
Yeah. Good evening, Ambassador Rajiv Sikri. Good evening, Sibal Saab. I read your articles very thoroughly, and it was a masterful exposition. I must congratulate you for making us enriched with your words of wisdom. Uh, Two, three very quick points. Putin's visit to India on 6th December, they were lurking in the background the bald eagle and the dragon, and that influenced the relationship between India and Russia. In fact, Russia experiences two kind of pressure. One is the internal and other is the external. External is of course from the US and the China, because they obviously will do, though our defense minister went and they gave the supply in 3 weeks time, that's okay. But do you think it will continue for future if such an eventuality or the situation warrants? That is one. See, and they, Russia has openly criticized or expressed its apprehension that USA is poaching India, and then Quad and all those things. In this kind of suspicion of Russia, how our relationship will unfold or will emerge in next few years? Because at the end of the round, I see we don't find USA being a permanent friend to us, nor we are moving away from Russia also. And how uh, our relationship with these four, I mean, total four countries, including India, China, Russia, and US, how it will emerge, because to me it looks quite dangerous. And let me quote two former ambassadors, one Vijay Gokhale and Vishnu Prakash, and both have said, the Vijay Gokhale has said in the China is a grand deception, and Vishnu Prakash on the other article 3-4 days ago, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash said that the relation between Russia and India, that was more on symbolism and less on action. So what's your take on these points?
Rajiv, if there's another question, I can take that. Otherwise,
Yeah, okay. I just said there was just one about apprehension about the rise of fundamentalism in Bangladesh. These two questions, and then I think we can conclude after that.
Okay. I have written about Putin's visit, and I think on the whole, it was very helpful and timely, and gave an opportunity to the two leaders who get along well together. And this is not just said because of the sake of diplomatic niceties, but they do have a good equation. And mind you, when we were presiding the UN Security Council in February or March this year, and Prime Minister was to address the UN Security Council, the only head of state who came was Putin, and the subject was maritime security. And there was concern that Russia may not agree to be represented at that level, because the West will not miss an occasion to target him on Black Sea and Crimea and everything else. But he came, and this was purely a personal gesture to our Prime Minister. And also the fact that he came, first time he traveled abroad in 2 years, once to meet Biden, which naturally he would, because that's the biggest challenge Russia is facing. And second time to meet our Prime Minister, even when the Ukraine episode was hanging on him like a Damocles sword. But he took time and he came. I think Russia understands, just as we understand, that the investments we've made in each other's ties for the last 6-7 decades can't be frittered away just like that. There are issues, yes. If they are concerned about our coming together with China, USA, we are concerned about their coming closer to China. But what are the triggers and the drivers of this? If we are coming close to United States, it's not because of Russia, because we want to maintain equally good relations at the appropriate level with Russia too. And if Russia is becoming closer to China, it's not because of India. It's again because of the United States. And the driver of that momentum is very different. So I think Russia understands or should understand the geopolitics sufficiently to know why India is coming closer to the United States, and that's because of China. And why Russia is coming closer to China because of the United States. Now, in the case of China, Russia can't help us because they have established not such close ties with China. But United States can be of assistance to us. So I think there is a mutuality of interest. There is an understanding of geopolitics. And apart from that, look, they've had 30 years of good relations with China. But how many centuries of mistrust, suspicion, and sense of danger from China, which has not disappeared. And Russia knows that China has already eaten into Russia's equities in Central Asia, even in Eastern Europe, even in a place like Belarus. All this BRI and stuff like that in Central Asia, it's eaten into whose power? It's eaten into Russian power. So they can't be oblivious to this. But the point is, in current circumstances, what choice do they have when they are being totally blocked towards the West and are being threatened and have been threatened with sanctions and have actually suffered sanctions? So they have moved eastward because they have to survive. But they also need India to maintain a certain balance in Asia, because Russia is also part of Asia. Now, how much of a balance they seek to maintain, the calibration of that is a result of outside factors. How much challenge the United States presents to Russia. If tomorrow the US reaches out to Russia and there's some accommodation, the desire of Russia and the compulsion of Russia to depend more and more on China would become less. And our own relationship with Russia will get released from a certain degree of pressure. So these are moving parts, and let's see how they move forward and what comes at the end of it. Insofar as Quad is concerned, Quad is not directed against Russia one bit at all. Russia is not an Indian Ocean power. They do have presence in the Indian Ocean. They do military exercises with us. It is not a very significant Pacific power too, though they have a Vladivostok fleet. We have exercised with the Vladivostok fleet, but they don't have the same maritime power as China has developed. So what does India do? Depend on Russia to take our chestnut out of fire with China? Depend on SCO, which is not supposed to discuss bilateral issues? Likewise, BRICS? No. We have to then rely much more on another country which faces similar challenges from China and wants to counter them for their own reasons, which suits our interests too. And to that extent, frankly, AUKUS serves our interests. The more challenge that China faces from US and Australia and Britain combined, it confines them, or let's say it makes their push out of the Western Pacific that much more difficult and delays their entry into the Indian Ocean in any sizable manner, because they have to first look after their security in the Western Pacific. So strategically, it serves their interest, whatever the Russians may think of it. We should not have a romantic view of our relations with any country, whether it is with China or with Russia. We should value those relationships to the extent that they meet mutual interests. And beyond that, now we are confident enough to be able to pursue our national interests a little more independently than before. Therefore, Vishnu Prakash is totally off the mark when he says the visit was symbolic. Certainly not. Certainly it was not symbolic. It was substantial in terms of signaling that it made. Let's not forget, he came at a time when the Chinese are sitting on our borders. So what message does it send to China? And he came at a time when when our relations with the United States have improved a great deal. But his coming here and our receiving him and having this 2+2 dialogue sends a powerful message of its own. Or as also to China, that what's the sense of India and Russia, in a sense, developing synergy between their defense and foreign policies. It's not vis-a-vis Pakistan or Central Asia or whatever. It is against the biggest challenges of the day, which is both United States and China. I think that's the significance. Insofar as fundamentalism in Bangladesh is concerned, there always has been. I think Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was right at one time, though he got a lot of flack when he said that 30% of the Bangladeshis are pro-Pakistanis, 30% are Bangladesh nationalists, and 30% are pro-India. So I don't think he was terribly off the mark. But to the credit of Sheikh Hasina, she has done remarkable things in curbing the Islamists. Can you imagine the people who were responsible for the assassination of her father? She's hanged them. And she's hanged the known personalities, the fundamentalist personalities in Bangladesh. At one moment, a few years ago, I was worried that she's going so much against the trends in the Islamic world, though they have changed now with Saudi Arabia and UAE, that whereas Islamic radicalism on the rise, and this lady is actually curbing them and guillotining them. And that these fellows, the Islamic radicals and the pan-Islamic network, will find some ways to topple her. Fortunately, it hasn't happened. And then lastly, and I'll end there, there's now connectivity that has developed between India and Bangladesh, the transit arrangements which are unprecedented, the power cooperation, power supplies, and etc. Trade, in fact, our biggest trade partner now in South Asia. So these are some fundamental kind of trends that have developed in our relationship, which will give stability to the relationship to some extent. For the rest, we've seen in Maldives what happened. There was this chap who was totally anti-Indian, most frustrating. Finally was thrown out and we got a new government. So if tomorrow the fundamentalists come to power, let's see how long they may last, because there are lobbies in Bangladesh who don't want to be fundamentalist. And so in any case, I'll end by saying here that you cannot plan in foreign policy in the way you might do your 5-year economic plans. Even there, you don't get the results you want. So, you can do any planning you want, but things may never pan out the way you want to. You have then to be smart and deal with the situations as they arise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sibal, for a masterly presentation and for so patiently and extensively answering the various questions that were posed to you. I think all of us have benefited enormously from your presentation and your very convincing answers. Thank you very much once again. And with these words, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Charan Singh for his concluding remarks and to conclude the seminar, the webinar.
Before I go further, I want to make an earnest, from my heart, genuine appeal. I would request Ambassador Sikri to be the speaker in January and Ambassador Sibal to chair the session.
No problem.
The reason is simple. The amount of information that has transacted today is so intense, and the chemistry between our audience and the two speakers, the chair and the speaker, is so beautiful. I think we will all benefit and the country will benefit. The things that have been discussed today, I'm sure there's just tip of the iceberg. Both of you are ambassadors, both of you are hardcore diplomats, and you have hidden much more than what you have shared. But whatever you have shared is so rich for us that we're really feeling hungry for more. So I'm going to approach both of you and with the request that not too distant, but in January, just let's reverse the roles and let's look at East the policy of Government of India. Look east. Let's go a little deep in it because we are a socio-economic think tank. Geopolitics plays an important role in economic growth and development. And if the country has to grow and the budget has to come, Look East is going to pay us a lot. So I'm going to come back to both of you and request you for a date in January. Now,
Thank
on
you.
my journey to concluding the session, I have listened to both ambassadors, and I have myself been in the thick of things in the US. And somehow I felt then that the world is a dog eat dog world. There's nobody which belongs to anybody. Each one is on his own. Survive or perish is at your own risk. A country with 1.3 billion people, with a 5,000-old civilization history, we have lots on our shoulders to ensure that we survive and make it big. I sometimes feel, not only for economists, but even for diplomats, reading, understanding Mahabharata is far more important than any other text because Mahabharata teaches you the objective is clear, rest everything has to follow the achievement of objective. Mathura is pretty near to Delhi, and I hope the next destination to develop will be Mathura because everybody in India should know Mahabharata by heart and the strategies that were done there to survive. Today's presentation, super rich, will be available. Ambassadors, are you comfortable if we release the recording?
No, please do that. Please do that.
Okay. So will be available by noon tomorrow. And we'll put it in public domain. You're welcome to look at our website and you will have it by noon tomorrow. Next Friday, we have young scholars, economists from Georgia Tech and London School speaking on tax incentives and small business. Keeping in mind that the budget is nearby, we have organized that talk. I would invite you all to please come and participate in that. With that, let me now once again thank Ambassador Sikri for chairing the session, Ambassador Sibal for sharing his thoughts, and the participants for having spent nearly 2 hours with us today on this important topic. I once again apologize for the technical snag that we had in the beginning, but I think the richness of the talk has fully or much more compensated than for the little delay that we suffered in the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.